Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and LRN. I'm Jeffrey Dale with Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is Culture as a Compliance Risk. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of the screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser, and please disable your pop-up blockers in order to ensure access to the exam. Once I've signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please be sure you are using Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. Oops, one too far. There we go. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Carlos Villagrán Munoz. He is a Chilean attorney who graduated from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile with a Master's of Law degree from Georgetown University. He currently serves as Director of Compliance at CMPC, a 100-year-old Chilean-based holding, one of the world-leading manufacturers of pulp, paper, packaging, personal care, and other forest products. With more than 19,000 employees, CMPC has industrial operations in 8 countries in Latin America, as well as commercial offices in the US, Europe, and China, selling and distributing its products to more than 45 countries around the world. He has previously served as a compliance officer for the Chilean operations of Liberty Mutual Insurance and Mitsubishi Financial Group, as well as legal intern at the World Bank's Integrity Compliance Office. I'd like to also welcome Nicole Diaz. She currently serves as Snap's Global Head of Integrity and Compliance Legal. In this role, she oversees the company's code of conduct, leads risk management in key areas such as anti-bribery, conflicts of interest, and trade law, runs internal investigations, and works cross-functionally to implement environmental, social, and governance into corporate governance. She is proud to serve as an industry leader, winning Compliance Department of the Year from Compliance Week, guest lecturing on ethics at Stanford and Duke, and contributing to the World Economic Forum white paper on the rise and role of the Chief Integrity Officer. Finally, Emily Miner. She is Director of LRN's Ethics and Compliance Advisory Practice. She counsels executive leadership teams on how to actively shape and manage their ethical culture through deep quantitative and qualitative understanding and engagement. A skilled facilitator, Emily emphasizes co-creative, bottom-up, and data-driven approaches to foster ethical behavior and inform program strategy. Emily has led engagements with organizations in the healthcare, technology, manufacturing, energy, professional services, and educational industries. She also co-leads LRN's ongoing flagship research on E&C program effectiveness and is a thought leader in the areas of organizational culture, leadership, and E&C program impact. Prior to joining LRN, Emily applied her behavioral science expertise in the environmental sustainability sector, working with nonprofits in several New England municipalities, facilitated earth science research in academia, and contributed to drafting and advancing international climate policy goals. Great to have you all with us. With that, I will turn it over to Carlos, Nicole, and Emily to get us started.
Thank you so much. So just to kind of kick off the conversation, we're here to talk about culture and how we think about culture. I think it's generally accepted that it exists in an organizational context and that it matters. It matters for business success, to recruit and retain employees, to enable innovation. We also know that culture has an important mediating role in how people behave and the decisions that they make. So we used to blame bad apples for shirking the rules and policies, but we now recognize that in so many cases of corporate misconduct, particularly those on a large scale, we really should be talking about a bad tree or the culture. And it's for this reason that global regulators, as well as business leaders, have brought a focus on corporate culture into their guidance documents. So you can see some excerpts on the slide here. But despite all of this, culture is still often viewed as being about employee engagement, and therefore it's often kind of strictly under the purview of HR, or the people function. So our conversation today is really to ask the question: what happens when we broaden our understanding of corporate culture to also view it as a compliance risk, or to paraphrase Michael Volkov, as a company's most effective internal control? So when we think not just about company culture, but ethical culture. And I want to start there by setting a baseline of what do we mean by ethical culture? And at LRN, we break ethical culture down into a number of different components, which are shown on the screen here. You might have your own terms for capturing these concepts, but or perhaps see some that aren't on here. And if that's the case, please drop them into the chat. But Nicole, Carlos, how do you think about ethical culture as a distinct part of the broader organizational culture? And how do you talk about that within your organizations?
Yeah, I can take that, Emily. Thanks so much for kicking us off. For me, it's really been a learning journey to understand the concept of ethical culture. I think there's a lot of different models out there. I really like the model that LRN has. And what I've actually done is I've just taken that slide with the pillars and shown it to people internally. And to help us understand that when we're talking about ethical culture, there is a formula to understand it. It has distinct pillars. These elements all come together. There's science behind it, because otherwise I think it gets a little bit fuzzy. People don't really understand what the term means or what it refers back to, and how it's distinct from culture at large. So that's really, I found the LRN model and the science behind it very useful.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that, and it's nice to learn that you're repurposing these materials and sharing them internally. So glad that they've been helpful. Do you experience any pushback, any roadblocks? Do you perceive that does the discussion change when you kind of bring in these different these different lenses or terminologies? Nicole and then Carlos would also love to hear your experience too.
Yeah, like I said, I think it is a learning journey. So, introducing a new concept to people, I think, requires a bit of a process where everyone sort of says, is this real? Why do we need to be thinking about this? Is this useful? Is it worth our time to be focusing on understanding our business through this lens? So there is an educational aspect to it. I think that there's, and the other thing I think that is I'm discovering is ethical culture. Even though I think compliance, we're the ones who are steeped in it, and it is most germane to our responsibilities. We don't own ethical culture. It is very cross-functional. Many different people within the company contribute to an overall healthy ethical culture. So I think anytime you're trying to do something extremely cross-functional within a business, it's slower than if you just, have something that's squarely just within your domain.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up that point about who owns ethical culture or who doesn't own it. I mean, I guess, the answer is that everybody owns it, but there are a number of key stakeholders that are really important to facilitate and foster a healthy ethical culture. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that later on, because it is a really important topic. Carlos, let me turn to you. Ethical culture versus company culture in general. Is this a distinction that you make at all at CMPC? Is it necessary to make that distinction? And how does that conversation play out?
Sure, Emily. Thank you for the question. We don't make that distinction when we're addressing our employees or the leaderships or the board or the managers, but we do make that distinction within as an ethics and compliance team. And I will talk about this later, but in my case, in the case of CMPC, the company to which I work for, we kind of discover the cultural, the ethical cultural issue in a bad way. We had to face a crisis, a cultural crisis, actually. And that was the point when we discovered that, okay, culture, it's a matter of, a system of shared values, some of which can be explicit or implicit, right? But then ethical culture means that those values are under a framework. It has you have tools, resources that you can use to conduct the behavior of people according to those values. I think that's kind of the difference we do, Emily, in terms of, okay, we can promote our values, show the values, update our values, for example, but there is this ethical cultural framework that usually is managed or in which the ethics and compliance team has a very important role to play that help the leaders and the employees to understand the values, to apply the values on a daily basis. And I think that we will talk about that later, to see culture as a compliance risk, meaning that you can identify risky situation, you can assess controls, you can mitigate, you can monitor. I mean, sometimes we face that problem in our companies. When you talk about culture, it seems sometimes, maybe it's a Latin American thing, but it seems like something very hard to understand, maybe some very theoretical or like an idea. But when you bring culture to a risk management, atmosphere, sometimes the leaders get a better understanding that they can play a role and that they can use culture, not just to promote the values, but actually for the company to achieve their goals and objectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate, well, first of all, I don't think it's just a Latin American thing. I think it's it's been my experience working with companies all over the world that it's a global idea that we're all struggling with, culture as this big sort of amorphous, and it is big, and you can talk about it in a lot of different ways, and culture of risk, culture of innovation, culture of ping pong tables and corporate snacks. There's lots of different ways to think about culture, and they're all real. It's just I think a question of which lever are you pulling for which purpose, and what are we talking about? But you kind of closed what you were just saying by this idea of bringing culture into a risk management framework. And that was really helpful for me because, I've been in a few conversations recently talking about culture as a risk, as a compliance risk. And on one hand, I can see that it is, and, all of the headlines kind of show us that it is. But on the other hand, I've sort of found myself wondering and talking with a colleague, actually, is there a negative there? Risk, it's something to be avoided. And so is there a risk in thinking about culture as a risk, in sort of putting this negative connotation on it? Or is it just pragmatic, and a frame of thinking that gives us tools to understand and address and prevent situations? I don't know. Culture as a risk do you see that as as a negative, as a practicality? would you put a different frame on this struggle that I'm having in thinking about it?
Emily, I don't think it has a negative connotation. I mean, ethics and compliance teams or ethics and compliance program, we are competing with many other initiatives within the company. We have sustainability, diversity and inclusion, innovation. I mean, we have to be very strategic in how we approach the business as the leaders. And for these guys who are managing the budget, the operation, acquiring new subsidiaries, I mean, when you talk about risk, you get their attention. They understand risk. They see risk as a natural component of business. So I think using the word risk to refer to culture as a compliance risk is the right thing to do. It's a strategic way to proceed because it really captures your audience, especially if you're thinking about the leadership. They will understand this is a risk, and then they will ask you, okay, if this is a risk that I need to consider when making business decisions, help me to assess that risk, to identify the risks, to mitigate them when it, or to let me know what I cannot tolerate as a risk, and help me to monitor that that's still under this moral or framework of values. I think it's the right approach. Not everyone is the same, of course, but in our particular case, with my team, that has been a good way to in a very pragmatic way, create like a beachhead, like a Troy horse in a good way, like talking about risk and then talking about values and culture. But then again, we're always talking about risk, so business leaders can see that as part of their, of their role, of their responsibilities.
Yeah, I agree with Carlos. I think that the risk management framework is very helpful because it helps people understand that ethical culture is something that they can manage, they can measure, and as I'll explain more later in the hour, can fit into things like risk assessments. At the same time, I think that it's only half of the conversation, because when you put on your risk management lens, right, your goal is preventing misconduct, preventing the bad behavior. And that leads you into a certain conversation, a certain way of thinking about the, actions you want to take. I think it's also important to think about, what I call, so I think of risk management, sort of the floor of compliance. We need to prevent misconduct, but the ceiling is, how do we promote above and beyond ethical leadership? And I think of this concept of ethical leadership as not having a ceiling to it. It's really, how people in the company are inspired by the values of the company to want to come up with innovative solutions that, are beneficial to not only the bottom line, but to the people that we do business with every day. And that's where I think you really get the intersection of ESG with values, with ethical governance. So I think when we're talking about ethical culture, I also like to put the framework of ethical leadership on it and think about how can we inspire superior action? How can we inspire people to do even more than what is required?
I want to kind of underline something that each of you said. Carlos, you talked about how when you use the language of risk, it gets people's attention. And it was actually this experience in another forum that sort of was the inspiration for this webinar topic. So, you're right. The language that we use means different things to different people. And so if if the goal is to have ethical culture be on the agenda, then, how do we talk about it? And how do we talk about it in a way that people, to Nicole's point, that aren't, steeped in ethics and compliance necessarily, how they can understand. And then Nicole, I love your framing of the floor and the ceiling, and that it's a helpful one to recognize that that both are important, and the way that we're going to approach the floor as well as this limitless ceiling is going to be different and require different tools. And that's a good segue to to kind of go in a little bit more on that floor and that ceiling at Snap. So Nicole, you are incorporating culture as a component of your risk assessment, which is not, what is typically, or at least traditionally, let's say traditionally, included in a risk assessment. So, we've got the U.S. sentencing guidelines on the left, which talk about the need to conduct that risk assessment, where it's more focused on criminal conduct, but then also we've moved beyond that and expanded the universe of risk assessment. But even so, I think incorporating culture as an actual metric as part of your risk assessment, I haven't heard as many organizations doing that. So I'd love to just talk a little bit. Tell us about that evolution. What's your strategy there, and what are you uncovering?
Yeah, well, the strategy came from a couple different places. First, it came from a real investigation into what is a risk assessment and what's the purpose. And I will tell you, I've attended a lot of conferences, listened to a lot of people talk, done a ton of benchmarking, and there are a million answers out there as to what people mean when they say risk assessment, who their audience is, what their intended outcome is. And so I think, there's certainly one model. What I've done is I've kind of created two buckets of risk assessment in my mind. One bucket of risk assessment, I think, is the compliance department needs to understand how the business works. You need to understand the day-to-day operations. You need to understand business units. So that you can assess risk and figure out how to implement controls. So that sort of risk assessment, I think, is informational. Primary audience, the compliance department itself, right? The other risk assessment I see as a real readout to the business. Business leaders don't need to be told what they're doing and what their business activities are. They know what they are, right? And they don't really need to necessarily go through the nuts and bolts of, understanding the development of controls. I think what they do need is they need a good understanding of the fabric of their team, of their office, and what exposure do they have such that good people who want to understand the policies, want to understand the rules, are not getting the support that they need. So they want to say, how can I support my team to do the right thing? And I think when you ask the question that way, ethical culture assessment is one of the best tools you can have to answer that question for the manager. So that's how we're deploying it, and we're looking, to deploy it for specific international offices, and we might offer to specific business units coming up. And we're still in that process. We've just gotten an initial readout, but I think it's extremely helpful to think about, where are the gaps in offering the support that team members need to act ethically. And obviously the worst gap would be something that leads to criminal conduct. So I wouldn't rule criminal conduct off the table in terms of being relevant to this assessment, but I think it goes beyond that, right? To say, where do you start to lose confidence in the ethics of the team? Where do people, not have the tools they need? So it goes deeper than just the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And, when you say it like that, it makes a lot of sense, right? That looking at ethical culture is one of the best ways of, figuring out where those gaps are, what the role of, what can business leaders do to close those gaps? And then, of course, you also pointed out that the worst case scenario is that the gaps lead to criminal conduct. And so if that's your floor, talk a little bit about your approach to the ceiling too. So, how are you building on, and I know that you're in early stages of viewing ethical culture as part of your risk framework, but more broadly speaking, what are some other ways that you are also trying to encourage that ethical behavior, that ethical leadership across SNAP? Right.
So that would be, I think it started with the creation of our code of conduct.
And let me pull up a screenshot here.
Next slide. You know, I think ideally a really good code of conduct ties those pieces together and creates a vision for ethical leadership, right? You need to have the compliance pieces, the floor in there as well, the risk management, but you wanted to have a vision that feels inspiring, that speaks to the values of the organization and has people say, right, that's us. We're out there to do the right thing. And this is how it ties directly into our mission as a company, into the way that we think about making decisions. So that we came out with that about a year and a half ago. And
I just want to say really quickly that I love your code. And, you know, one of the things that I love about it and why I pulled this particular screen grab is that, I mean, I hadn't heard you talk about the floor and the ceiling before this conversation, but I see it in here so clearly where you talk about, you know, what are we here for? Like, we're here to be kind. This is the guide to kind business. And what does that mean? And it even says in the little call out thing, to be kind, we must comply with the law and our policies, and we must go beyond, et cetera, invest in the health of our stakeholders. It's not enough to avoid misconduct. We must act as responsible corporate citizens in all that we do. It broadens the discussion so much. It is really inspiring. There's this positive, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Google's old motto, don't be evil, which is like, it's the negative of, or, you know, or the inverse of, whereas, no, it's not don't be mean, it's be kind. So I came across your code a while ago, and it just really stood out to me as a different one. So sorry to interrupt.
I hope people also see the echoes of ESG in there, because I think ESG is a really wonderful framework for capturing the output of ethical leadership. So, you know, the floor is don't commit misconduct. The ceiling is let's think about our impact in the world through the vehicle of this company. How can we make sure that impact is positive, and how can we create a culture where that sort of leadership is supported and flourishes? So so we did that through the lens of our value of being kind, which is an amazing lens to think about ethical leadership through. It's very embedded in our culture. And we're looking at how can we continue the conversation beyond just this code. So we've started a speaker series where we're inviting senior leaders from the company to talk about kind business and how they make good decisions, how they think about ethical leadership. And we're also looking to create more ways to have this concept of ethical leadership, of kind business, be really integrated into our development path at Snap, into our managerial profile. So again, it's not like a compliance training, right? It's a way to think about growth at the company.
The speaker series that you mentioned, I'm just curious because, I mean, it's what a great way to take the values off the wall, or we have fewer and fewer corporate walls these days. So off the website, and make it real by having people actually dissect, how do I apply this in my role and the situations that I encounter? So are these speaker series, are they available to everyone in the organization? Is it a leader talking to their team? So it's more focused on what that team kind of does. Like, it's such a great example. I'd love to learn a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. It's company-wide. It's me. I am the producer, the questioner. But there is one actually really cool element that we brought in. We have this thing at Snap called Counsel, which is sort of a technology for listening from the heart. And it's a very old technology. It comes from indigenous traditions, native traditions of bringing people into a circle and passing an object that gives each person a chance to speak one at a time. And the way that counsel work is it's geared around storytelling. So it brings people out of your analytical task list mind into a shared space where people slow down and they start to share personal stories. And that has really, it's been a wonderful addition to our culture. It's one that our CEO brought in. And I actually think it's a wonderful tool for ethical leadership because it does, hopefully ethical leadership, when we're doing it right, is something that brings us more into our human side at work, right? Reminds us who we are, what's important, what are we about, and that we're making decisions from that place throughout the day. So we brought the council practices into the Kind Business Speaker Series and have formatted the speaker series through council questions that invite personal storytelling on topics that are relevant to ethics, like role models or people who inspire you, or, times when, having to balance competing concerns, which are all really difficult questions that we all grapple with, or inspirational topics that we, are important to us as we all figure out how to be good business leaders.
Thank you so much. I love that. I'm gonna. You're giving me a lot to think about, and I appreciate you sharing those specific examples. I think that there's, that's something that I hope a number of those in the audience feel that they could repurpose in a way that makes sense for their contexts and for their cultures, their organizational cultures. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit and bring you into the conversation, Carlos, because you or CMPC, has your ethics and compliance program was really established kind of in response to a cultural breakdown that led to some corporate misconduct that occurred more than a decade ago. And so, you've kind of have an interesting case study, if you will, to bring in to this discussion of the role of culture and culture as a compliance risk. So I'd love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about, like, set the stage for us with this case, and then how, with that kind of hindsight, what is CMPC doing to invest in your culture, as well as your policies, your controls, and sort of those other elements that you need for the floor, as well as the ceiling?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's good. Let me see if it's working. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. Okay. So yes, what I would like to do in the next in a couple of next minutes is to share with you, with the ethics and compliance community, with ethics and compliance professional, what we as a company and we as a team we have learned from a cultural crisis. Okay. And as Emily just said, I would like to spend a few minutes setting the stage and telling you what happened with our company a few years ago. So our crisis, the name of our crisis is the tissue cartel. Okay. Think about CMPC. It's a big, old, very traditional company. Of course, it's based in Chile, but it has operations all around Latin America. It has commercial offices in Europe, China, and the US. It's always has been seen as a very traditional company, very, very well respected. Kind of a best place to work in a way, And then, all of a sudden, the company, it became public that the company, that 2 out of like 30 subsidiaries, but 2 subsidiaries of the group were engaged or involved in a cartel, in collusion with competitors to control the market in Peru and in Chile. This case, it was investigated in Chile and Peru. This cartel, the collusion with competitors, took 10 years. So we're not talking about a few bad apples that had a bad day and they had like super aggressive business objectives. No, when I'm telling you that this cartel happened for 10 years, and we're thinking more, not just internal controls failure, we're talking about a cultural problem here, right? So we're talking a cartel that was discovered in Peru and Chile. In Chile, was discovered in Peru as well in 2015. The trial ended in 2020. Around 2020, you can see part of the outcome there. Of course, they were fines were applied to both operations in Peru and Chile. The company reached an agreement to try at least to compensate the final consumers, because just a quick message, but when it comes to antitrust infringement, the real victims are the consumers, and the company tried in a way to compensate those final consumers, and you can see the numbers there. We lost clients, business opportunity, and talent. And we usually say this when you usually see this when somebody's telling about a corporate crisis. Sure, but let me give you two very clear examples of that impact. Almost on a monthly basis, I had to have a meeting with the procurement team and the commercial team to help them to convince potential clients or potential vendors to have a contract with us to sell the products, or so we can sell the products to them. Because of course, if you Google online, you Google CMPC, you will immediately find a huge red flag because of this case. And sometimes we are not able to convince those clients and those vendors, because they see this is a huge case. We don't see that you're actually doing the right stuff today. And those are very, very practical examples of how we lose business opportunities and talent. Just the last year, I had to be part of 3 onboarding process in which or selection process in which some candidates were hesitating about accepting the offer from CMPC because they were afraid of this case. And HR team asked me to intervene and, like Carlos, try to convince them that we are the best company and a great salary. And I was like, you know what? We have been very transparent about this case. I will explain them what really happened and what are the lessons we have learned from that case. A high reputational impact, and then a complete overhaul of the corporate governance structure, business strategy, and leadership. And then on the right, you can see some images, some pictures that just show a little bit the real impact of this case. I'm telling you, we're talking about a very well-known and prestigious company in the region. And even the president at that time of Chile, which is Michelle Bachelet, was at that time, she was part of the ones pushing for harder fines and sanctions to our company. She was part of a huge overhaul of the antitrust regulation in Chile because of this case. I remember at that time I wasn't working at TMPC, but I remember my wife and I, we decided not to buy any products from CMPC anymore. And you went to the supermarket and people were protesting at the supermarket. Of course, then I joined CMPC, and then I am, of course, I'm buying the products of our company, sure. But everyone knew about this case, and the company started little by little working, and one first value or lesson, I will say, from the crisis emerged, which was transparency. The company decided to fully collaborate with authorities, fully, show what happened, what went wrong. You can see there the lessons we learned. I mean, the company started a campaign to really not talk about from the side of credits, we're going to fix this like this and that, but rather on the side of this is what happened. We never thought this were to happen to us. And of course, I can tell you the causes behind this cultural factor. Right now, almost like 3-4 years have gone since the case is closed. We have all the information. I can give you in a more scientific way the causes behind this cultural factor. Silos and subcultures in those two particular subsidiaries. The leaders, no, I mean, their objectives were completely disaligned from the culture of the company. These guys were receiving different messages, Emily. I mean, from one side, the board, the leaders were telling about we need to protect our market share. On the other side, no, we need to be careful and be careful with the competition. I mean, very different and mixed messages here and there. No accountability, no speak up, and of course the traditional checkbox compliance, which I think when you face this kind of situations, it is better to don't have compliance at all and say, okay, I don't know how to do compliance in my company, rather than to say, yes, I have a compliance, but it's on the paper, nobody knows about it. It's really like, it gives you the idea, and to the regulators, authorities, that you did that on purpose. I mean, you have a compliance program, but it was not real. But I want to avoid giving you like the final result. I want you to see by yourself. And I will present 4 statements made by CMPC executives that were part of the cartel. This is public information, by the way. And I will try to, please help me with this. These are the guys who are being asked about, what happened by the authorities, of course. And this is how they talk about what the collusion meant for them. Look at the first one. At lunch, he said, and he's talking about the competition. My competitor told me that with those prices, his company was going bankrupt, right? And in order to survive, he had to raise prices. And I said, as a CMPC executive, that my mandate was to recover market share. So this guy from CMPC, who was part of the collusion, he's talking about, look at the words he's using. The mandate, my mandate was to do this and that. What kind of instruction or order this guy received, and from who? Again, CMPC, very traditional, old-fashioned company, very vertical company, in which what the leader says, that's what we're going to do. It doesn't matter about policies and procedures or strategy. My boss said it that way, that's my mandate. Look at the second guy. The CMPC executive said that the system, he's talking about the collusion, the cartel, was already operating in 2001, and it seemed like it was something very normal. Now, when some conduct or behavior becomes normal, it becomes normal where it's tolerated, accepted, and rewarded. And in this case, this conduct was accepted, not only tolerated, accepted, and it was rewarded. These guys received many awards and prizes within the company because they were like real leaders with good numbers, and everybody loved to work with these guys. Look at the third one. I believe that we were very aggressive, commercially speaking. We protected our market share in a very commercially aggressive manner. Look, there is nothing wrong with being aggressive. I mean, this is a business, right? I mean, they are running a business. That's right. I mean, they have to do that. But what does it mean for them to be aggressive? What are the boundaries here? Are there any moral or cultural boundaries? And finally, one guy said, I was not aware that it was actually a thing. The collusion was real, but there was always rumors and comments. And now we're talking about the speak up. We had 10 years to stop this from happening, and we couldn't do it. It had to come from outside. The internal investigation we initiate because the authority warned us about some red flags and alerts. So I'm showing you this because in the next slide, I will share with you what we as an ethics and compliance team we have learned in terms of culture as a risk, okay? So what you're seeing there you go. I mean, this, again, we're not, inventing the wheel again at all, please. But this is how we see this situation now. We have a team. We joined the company in 2018. We have to manage a compliance program for 20,000 employees, right? And now, sorry. Oh, somebody's, I think it's moving the slides. There you go. Yeah, great, awesome. Okay, so, and the only task the board and the management asked us to do was, please, we cannot allow this from happening again. And if you are talking about a cultural crisis, a cultural factor, then we need to address culture as a risk. I won't spend much time on this, I promise you, Emily, but I think this is the key part of my presentation. We believe that culture is a system of shared values. Okay, when you join an organization, you have your own experience and beliefs. That's fine. When you join a company, you make a commitment to be part of a system of shared values. And those shared values, sure, are sometimes, usually in companies, are explicit. We're brave, innovation, respect, diversity. That's fine. Those are explicit principles and values. But then, how can we manage culture as a risk? That means that if we consider culture as how people do things as a risk that That means that it can be managed, assessed, mitigated, treat, and monitor. Motivations, these are the gears, the elements, the components. In a way, if you allow me to say, these are the nerves that the leaders, the company leaders can struck, and then they can get people from doing one thing or another thing. They set the objectives and expectations. They, in a way, manage organizational justice. It was crucial when it comes to our crisis. They are the ones who, when somebody doesn't comply with what with our internal rule, for example, they are the ones who apply this organizational justice. Context and strategy. We have a history, 100 years old history, and this crisis emerged. We have to deal with that history. That history has to be part of our culture, and we need to manage that as part of a risk management atmosphere, right? Business environment, risk and opportunities, leadership, tone and style. I think at that time, the company didn't actually care about the type of leader, that was actually joining the company. They didn't care about that. And then the standard practices. We usually, as compliance team, we focus our attention on standard and practices. And there is way more than that when it comes to culture as a compliance risk. And then the main, the bottom line here is culture as a compliance risk. Absolutely, Emily, because that's allow us as a compliance team to identify risk, analyze, mitigate, and monitor. And that allows us as well to explain the leaders that they are the one moving those gears. They are the one who have that power in a way, but we as a compliance team, we will provide the framework of values, on principles, of inspiration, so they can, get to their objectives and comply with the objectives and rules, etc. And finally, some courses of action, if you allow me to say so, that we have been working lately. Speak up for transparency. As I said before, this was like the first lesson we learned from this case, from the crisis. The importance of speak up and transparency. And I know what you're looking there is just information about the hotline. Transparency and speak up goes way beyond the hotline. And Emily, you know about this, but we ran a survey with the help of our friends from LRN for the first time as a company. And out of those guys, those employees who have seen misconduct, 70% of them reported that to their supervisor, to their managers. That's fine, that's normal. But that is saying that hotline is just one of many other tools. I mean, we need to empower our managers because they are the first line of defense. And that's why we are focusing our leadership training on that tone, on that message. And we have a special training program just for leaders. And the name is Words and Action. And that's taken from the DOJ compliance program guidelines. That says, there's a question that says, how leaders with their words and action promote ethical behavior. That's the name of our program. We will give you as a leader real practical examples of how you can set the tone, listen and guide, support, reward, and correct. How you can exercise your leadership according to our ethics and compliance program. And finally, we're in the middle of updating our compliance strategy. 4 years have passed since we joined the company. Now, we would like to talk to, as Nicole said, now we want to inspire. The rules are clear. The do's and don'ts, everybody knows about that. Now we want to go to the next step. We want to inspire. And you can see that we're moving from integrity and compliance program to just integrity program, trying to now inspire people to do the right thing. It doesn't matter the rule. The context can change, like COVID, right? All the rules and policies and procedures with COVID didn't work because we were operating under very extraordinary circumstances. That's why we want to talk about integrity, and the motto of our company is creating natural value, and that's where we think that integrity should be our natural value. So that's sorry if I take a little bit longer, Emily, but that's a little bit very short summary of our experience and the lessons we have learned.
Carlos, thank you so much. I know that's it's hard to summarize, 10, 15, 20 years in a few minutes. But I think it's so helpful to really illustrate what do we mean when we're talking about culture as a compliance risk, and what can you do from a risk management and prevention aspect. And I mean, this last sort of column that you have here, from rules to values, that's a great way to put it, of moving beyond that, the risk prevention to the inspiration. So thank you for sharing that detail with us. And I've been monitoring the questions from people in the audience, and just some of them have talked about auditing culture and ways to understand culture. So I want to just share this really briefly, and there's some resources here too of how do we measure ethical culture? And Carlos, you talked about employee surveys. Nicole, I know that you've incorporated that as well. But here are some other avenues to collect this kind of information. So if you think back to that slide that kind of broke down culture and what is or broke down ethical culture, a direct source of understanding what the state of your ethical culture is to go directly to employees. And so these are some ways: surveys, focus groups, roundtables, exit interviews, et cetera. But then there's also a lot of indirect ways that, that we can keep a pulse on the ethical culture in our organizations. Looking at turnover rates, absenteeism, promotion rates by department. Is there a department here or there that's kind of standing out, whether that's standing out in a positive way or in a negative way? Of course, we have, disclosures, hotlines, which, as you pointed out, Carlos, the hotline is just a piece of everything that's going on. So it's not necessarily holistic, but it tells a lot there. So I just wanted to kind of share those briefly, for those in the audience to kind of think about ways that you probably already are able to keep a pulse on what's going on in your organization, and some ways that you might strengthen that further. So we have a number of questions, but before we do that, I want to close with something that Nicole alluded to in the beginning, which is about the ownership of ethical culture and recognizing that it's not just ethics and compliance. And I'd love if you could each just, maybe your top 2 partners in fostering ethical culture, just name who they are so that we have time to, to turn it over to the audience Q&As. But who do you see as your top 2 partners partnering with ethics and compliance or your integrity programs to foster and facilitate ethical culture? Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Oops, I was muted. I'll give you 4. The
Okay.
senior leaders and higher level managers of the company, the employee relations, the L&D team, or whoever's in charge of developing the leadership path at the company, and the ESG team, who is creating that inspirational model of the positive impact of the company.
Awesome, thank you. And there's a question in here about ESG, so I'm going to come back to that in a second. But Carlos, who are your top 2 or 3 or 4 partners in fostering ethical culture?
I will say top 3. Well, I will have to go with HR. Okay, I will have to go with HR, and there is a team within HR that a particular crucial team at this moment, which is diversity and inclusion. And just one minute to tell a short story. We are working with diversity and inclusion as a compliance team on an ambassadors program for the next year. We didn't know we would have many things in common, that the message was the same. Of course, the contents can differ, but right now, because of an activity we did in Brazil, we realized that diversity and inclusion and ethics and compliance can, use the same platform, the same message, and to deliver the same story behind that. So at this moment, Emily, I would say HR, of course, sustainability, legal, internal audit, risk management, sure, but at this moment, we're working a lot with diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. So the ESG question here, and there's a lot of great questions in the chat. So one is, let me scroll back to where I saw it.
The links between ethics and compliance and ESG?
Yes.
And I can jump in and answer that. I really see, there are a lot of links, but relevant to today's discussion, I really see ethics and compliance as playing a leading role in the G part of ESG, the governance. And right now, I think the governance tends to be reduced towards the minimum components, right? What's your, do you have a whistleblower helpline? Do you have, a bribery training? Ideally, I would see the G in ESG as how do you create a healthy ethical culture at your company that both prevents misconduct and inspires ethical leadership? So, we partner very closely with our ESG team. Our work goes into their report, but we also partner together to think about exactly that question of how can the work I'm doing create more people who are doing amazing positive impact things at the company that support the environmental and social prongs of the ESG mission.
Thank you. We have another question in here about whether you require managers to submit a certification that they have escalated or reported a concern that was reported to them to compliance, or I would broaden that to whichever sort of channel is appropriate. It might be HR, it might be, a different one. And I think this is an important question because Carlos talked about how 70% of employees that observed misconduct reported it to their manager. There's a lot of research that reinforces somewhere that ballpark. Ethisphere has done research that's found that too. So, I think it's safe to say in most organizations, most people are bringing things up to their managers, and if you don't know what's going on, it's hard to address it. So, Nicole or Carlos, do you have a way of tracking this at all?
Well, Emily, we do use certification in my case, but we ask that right after the training sessions. We kind of use training session with in a very practical approach, and we get that certification from the ones who participated, especially managers and leaders, in a way because you have been part of a training for 1 hour, let's say, okay, and now you know very well that things are not allowed in a company. So I will ask you again. Have you seen any situations, any misconduct, using this training to remind, to refresh your memory that you should be reporting, or do you haven't escalated in a proper way?
Okay, thank you. Nicole, what about you? Do you capture manager level reports in any way?
We don't use certification. The ethical culture survey that LRN offers does include questions on that. Whether or not people have escalated issues that they have, misconduct that they've observed. But we don't do a separate certification process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you both. Let's see, maybe one more. The DOJ program that was referred to, I believe that's the Department of Justice Evaluating Corporate Compliance Programs Guidance document. I actually think it's a great read. So encourage those of you who haven't read it to check it out. And then, lastly, some questions about, graphics and code of conduct and the importance of making things visually dynamic to kind of sell your message. And I think that both your code, Nicole, or SNAP's code, and then some of the examples that you shared, Carlos, of the posters and your branding for the program. I think it's important because that's what catches people's eyes. It makes you want to look at the material. So we see the visuals, the colors, the images before we see the words. So I would say yes, that's important. And I know that we are at time, so I will unfortunately close it there. I apologize to those of you who we weren't able to get to your questions, but thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and a special big thanks, Nicole and Carlos, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Emily.
And thank you, Compliance Week.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for the very informative session, everyone. Again, our speakers today were Carlos, Nicole, and Emily. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to LRN for making this webcast possible. This concludes our webcast, so thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.